What did my father write in the letter he left before he disappeared? The letter was in a manila envelope tucked between the refrigerator and the kitchen wall, in the 3-inch gap where my father used to drop his keys when he came home drunk and couldn't find his pockets. I found it on a Thursday morning, 6 days after he'd been reported missing, while I was cleaning the kitchen because cleaning was the only thing that made the waiting feel like doing something. The envelope had my name on it, Adayeze, written in his handwriting, the specific slanted capitals he used when he was writing something he wanted to be clear about. I stood in the kitchen with the refrigerator humming and the morning light coming through the window over the sink, and I held the envelope for a long time before I opened it. I was 26 years old. My father, Chukwuemeka Okafor, had been missing for 6 days, and whatever was in this envelope had been waiting between the refrigerator and the wall for at least that long. Possibly longer. Possibly while I'd been standing in the same kitchen making coffee and not knowing it was there. I opened it. There were 4 pages, handwritten, front and back. The first line said, "By the time you read this, there are things you need to know about what happened to your mother." I had been living in my father's house in Cincinnati for 8 months when the disappearance happened, having moved back after my mother Ngozi's death the previous year to help manage the estate and, honestly, to be closer to the grief in a way that living alone in my Columbus apartment hadn't allowed. My father was 61, a retired civil engineer who had spent 30 years building a reputation for precision and reliability and who, in his retirement, had developed a habit of long morning walks, careful silence, and the occasional glass of Hennessy that had never, in my recollection, become anything more alarming than occasional. He was not a man who disappeared. He was a man who knew where everything was, who balanced his checkbook by hand, who called me every Sunday at 7 p.m. and talked for exactly 45 minutes, because he believed long phone calls were a form of inefficiency. The Sunday before he was reported missing, he'd called at 7:02 and talked for 38 minutes about my mother's rose bushes, which he'd been maintaining since her death with the same precision he'd applied to everything else. Then he'd said, "Good night, Adayeze, I love you," and hung up. And then, 4 days later, on a Wednesday morning, he was gone. The first flag I'd missed was 8 months earlier, when I'd moved back into the house and found, in the process of settling in, that my mother's home office, a small room she'd used for her work as a retired school administrator, had been emptied of most of its contents. Not fully cleaned out, just selectively reduced. Some file boxes gone, the bottom drawer of her desk locked in a way it hadn't been before, a specific group of photographs removed from the corkboard she'd kept above the desk. I'd noticed and asked my father, who'd said he'd been going through her things slowly, that it was easier to do it in pieces, which was a reasonable explanation for a grieving man, and which I'd accepted completely. The second flag was a conversation I'd overheard 2 months into my stay. My father on the phone in his study, speaking in a low, controlled voice, and the phrase "not now and later" and the other name very clearly. A name I didn't recognize, a woman's name, Ewan Day. I'd told myself it was a colleague, a friend, someone from the church community. The third flag was the locked file box I found under his bed while retrieving a book he'd asked me to get, which I'd noted, closed again, and not asked about because he was a private man and I was a respectful daughter, and we had, between us, a long-established agreement about the limits of inquiry. The letter changed all of it in 4 pages. My father had written it in 2 sittings, which I could tell from the slight shift in pen pressure between page 2 and page 3. The first 2 pages were about my mother's death. Ngozi Okafor had died of a cardiac event 11 months ago, officially after a short hospitalization. The letter said, this was not the complete picture. My father had written, carefully, and in full sentences, that had been revised and refined the way an engineer revises calculations, that my mother had been in significant distress in the 18 months before her death. Not cardiac distress, but financial and psychological distress. And that the source of the distress was a man named Victor Solano, who had been my mother's business partner in a small property management company she'd maintained through her retirement, and who had, over 3 years, systematically redirected cash from the company into personal accounts that Victor controlled. My mother had discovered this 14 months before her death. She had confronted Victor. She had then, according to my father's letter, begun receiving communications that he described as threatening without being explicitly so. A skill in intimidation that left no provable record. My mother had told my father about the financial fraud. She had told him about the communications. She had not told the police because Victor Solano had, my father's letter said, a specific and documented relationship with 2 members of the local business community whose social connections extended to the police department, and because my mother had been afraid of what provable nothing threats could become. She had died 11 months ago. My father had spent the past 11 months documenting everything. The 4 pages ended with a sentence that I read 3 times before it settled. I've taken what I've assembled to someone who can use it. And if you're reading this, it's either because I've found somewhere safe to be while the process works itself out, or because something has happened to me, and you need to know what I knew. I called the detective assigned to my father's missing persons case within 45 minutes of reading the letter. Her name was Detective Amara Osei, a Cincinnati PD detective who'd been working missing persons for 9 years and who had, in my previous interactions with her, been professional and procedurally thorough in a way that I'd found steady rather than warm. I told her about the letter. She came to the house within 2 hours, brought an evidence technician, and the letter was photographed and bagged and documented as part of the investigation with a chain of custody form that Detective Osei walked me through before taking it. She read the contents in the kitchen, standing, with the measured stillness of someone processing information and making rapid, invisible decisions about what it changed. Then she asked me 3 questions. How long had my mother and Victor Solano been business partners, whether I knew the name of the person my father had said he'd taken his documentation to, and whether I had access to my mother's business records. The answer to the first was 7 years. The answer to the second was I didn't know. The answer to the third was that I had access to whatever was in the house, which turned out to be more than I'd realized. The locked file box under my father's bed opened with a key I found in the 4th page of the letter, taped to the lower corner. Inside were 3 folders and a USB drive. The first folder contained printed bank statements from the property management company covering 3 years, with amounts circled in red pen that totaled, when I added them on my phone's calculator, $214,000 in transfers to accounts that were not the company's operating or payroll accounts. The second folder contained copies of 11 text messages, printed out with timestamps, between my mother's number and an unknown number, in which the unknown number said things like, "It would be a shame if this became complicated, and I hope you're taking care of yourself in ways that sat in the gray zone between concern and threat, without crossing into anything actionable." The third folder contained a document my father had prepared himself. A chronology, 15 pages, typed and printed, documenting every transfer, every communication, every relevant event, with dates and amounts and sources annotated in the margin in his engineer's hand. The USB drive, which I plugged into my laptop at Detective Osei's request, contained scanned copies of everything in the folders, plus additional bank records going back further, and a series of email exchanges that my mother had exported from her account before her death, which showed Victor Solano first proposing the fund diversification that was the original mechanism of the fraud, in language smooth enough that my mother had not immediately recognized it as such. The second professional who became central to what happened next was a financial crimes investigator named Daniel Achebe, who worked for the Ohio Attorney General's office, and who had been in fraud investigation for 14 years. Detective Osei connected me to him the day after she'd reviewed the folder contents. He had a methodical and serious quality that I recognized from my father, the quality of someone who understood that the distance between documentation and proof was considerable, and that the distance had to be closed carefully. He reviewed the materials I provided and spent 3 days examining the additional financial records his office could access through a formal inquiry. And he called me on a Monday morning to say that the pattern my father had documented was consistent with systematic misappropriation over approximately 36 months, and that the amounts involved when the AG's office completed their preliminary review were likely higher than my father's estimate, potentially in the range of $280,000 to $320,000. He said the documentation my father had assembled was, in his professional assessment, unusually thorough for a non-forensic accounting source, and that it had provided a significant head start. He said this in a way that made me think of my father at his kitchen table, working in the silence of an empty house, building a case with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years building things that had to hold. My father had been missing for 12 days when we found the person he'd taken his documentation to. It happened sideways, through the letter's reference to someone who could use it, which I'd been turning over in my mind since the first reading. My mother's closest friend was a woman named Blessing Tamboli, a retired attorney who'd moved from Cincinnati to Columbus 3 years earlier. My father and Blessing had been in intermittent contact since my mother's death, which I knew because Blessing had mentioned calling him. I contacted Blessing on a Wednesday and asked carefully whether my father had been in touch recently about anything related to my mother's business. There was a pause in the conversation that told me before she spoke. She said yes. She said he'd come to Columbus 2 weeks before he'd been reported missing, had spent an afternoon at her kitchen table, and had left with her a copy of everything that was now in the box and in Detective Osei's evidence file. Blessing, acting in what she described as a personal rather than professional capacity, had contacted a journalist she knew, a reporter named Sola Adeyemi, who covered financial crimes for a regional investigative publication, and had provided him with the documentation under conditions of confidentiality. Sola Adeyemi had been working on verification of the story for 12 days. He had been told when he reached out to Victor Solano's company for comment that the story was baseless. He had continued working. The crisis that compressed everything came on the 14th day after my father disappeared, when Detective Osei called me at 6:40 a.m. She said they had a lead on my father's location and needed me at the precinct within the hour. I drove there in the early morning with the specific quality of alertness that comes from not having slept properly in 2 weeks, my hands on the wheel and the city going past in the gray light. What Detective Osei told me at the precinct was that a man matching my father's description had been seen at a motel in a suburb 40 miles outside Cincinnati, and that officers had made contact, and that he was safe. He was safe. I had to ask her to repeat it. She said it again. Safe, unharmed, voluntary absence. He was at the precinct within 2 hours, driven in by a uniformed officer, and when he came through the door, he looked like himself except for the specific diminishment of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has recently set it down. I stood up and he held me for a long time in the precinct waiting room without saying anything. What he told me, and then told Detective Osei, was that he had left the house because he had been afraid. Not of Victor Solano directly, of what Victor Solano might do when he discovered that the documentation had been provided to a journalist and to the AG's office, which my father had learned was increasingly likely from a communication Blessing had relayed. He'd gone to the motel under a name he'd paid cash under, left the letter for me, and had been waiting for the process to move far enough that his presence at home would no longer make him a useful target. He'd been in contact with Blessing the entire time, who had known he was safe and had not told me because he'd asked her not to, which was a decision Blessing and I have discussed at length since and which I understand and have not forgiven in equal measure. He'd come back when Detective Osei's office had made contact because the investigation was now formal and documented, and his disappearance was doing more harm than good to the people who needed him present. Victor Solano was charged 9 weeks after my father returned. The Ohio AG's office filed charges of grand theft, money laundering, and breach of fiduciary duty. The filing was a 42-page document that cited the financial records from my mother's company, the bank transfer pattern, and additional documentation the AG's investigators had obtained through subpoena. Sola Adeyemi published his article 2 days after the charges were filed, in a piece that was specific and factual and that named Victor Solano and described the fraud in the granular detail that only careful documentation over 3 years could produce. The article was shared widely in the Cincinnati business and legal community, which is a relatively compact world where reputation is structural, and Victor Solano's reputation in that world did not survive the article in any functional sense. His property management company, which had continued operating during the investigation, lost 3 major clients within 2 weeks of publication. His attorney issued a statement calling the charges politically motivated, which is the statement issued when there is no substantive defense to the evidence. The statement did not gain traction. The third professional I want to name is the medical examiner who had certified my mother's cause of death as cardiac event 11 months earlier. I want to name her to say that her original certification was not wrong. My mother died of cardiac arrest. What the investigation and my mother's own documented communications with my father established was that the 18 months of documented stress and the psychological weight of sustained low-grade threat had measurably affected her health in ways that were concurrent with the fraud and the intimidation. This was not sufficient to add charges against Victor Solano in connection with her death, which is a legal determination I understand and which does not address the full shape of what happened to her. The medical examiner's name was Dr. Josephine Orellano, and she was thorough and honest and ultimately limited, as we all are, by what the evidence can formally prove. Victor Solano pleaded no contest to grand theft and breach of fiduciary duty 8 months after the charges were filed, receiving a 5-year sentence with 2 years to be served in custody and the remainder suspended, along with a restitution order of $292,000 to the estate of Ngozi Okafor. The restitution amount was less than the fraud total, reflecting the limits of what the financial investigation could directly attribute. My father sat in the courtroom for the plea hearing, in a suit, with his hands folded on his knees, and watched the proceedings with the composure of a man who had spent 11 months preparing for this and had finally seen it arrive. I sat beside him. The courtroom was quiet and procedural in the way of courtrooms, which do not provide the emotional resolution that people sometimes expect from them, just the institutional confirmation that the thing you knew to be true has been officially recognized as true by a process that requires evidence. The house on Clemens Drive, that was my grandmother's house in another story, but my father's house in this one is on Fairfield Avenue, and it is where we went after the plea hearing. He made tea in the kitchen, the same way he always made it, and we sat at the table where I'd found the envelope, and I asked him, because I needed to ask, and because enough time had passed that I thought I could receive the answer without it destroying something, why he hadn't told me what he'd been doing. He thought about it for a long time before he answered, which was characteristic, and then he said he'd been afraid that if he told me and something happened to him, I would try to continue what he'd started, and that he had not wanted that weight on me. He said my mother hadn't wanted that weight on me either, which was why she hadn't told me about Victor Solano while she was alive, why she'd carried it in the house with my father and kept it from the Sunday phone calls. I looked at him and felt the specific complicated grief of understanding that 2 people who loved you had been carrying something enormous while talking to you normally, and that the normalcy had been a form of protection, and that protection and withholding are sometimes, in families, the same gesture. I put my hand on the table near his, and we sat there with our tea and the rose bushes visible through the kitchen window. My mother's company was formally dissolved 6 months after the plea. The restitution payments, received over 18 months, went into an account I manage jointly with my father, to be used for purposes we haven't fully decided yet. I've thought about it often, what the right use of returned stolen money is, whether there is a right use, whether using it at all is a kind of acknowledgement that its return constitutes some completion of what was taken. I don't have a settled answer. My father has suggested putting it toward a scholarship in my mother's name at the school where she worked for 20 years, and I think that's probably what we'll do. And I think she would find it appropriate with the specific dry precision she applied to things she found appropriate. Blessing Tamboli and I repaired the breach in our relationship slowly, the way you repair things that were broken by necessity rather than malice, which is different from things broken by choice. She had been protecting my father at his request, which is what old friends do, and I had been excluded from knowledge that directly concerned me, which is what feels like betrayal even when it isn't. We're on the other side of it now. She came to Cincinnati for my mother's second memorial service, a small one, held a year after the first, after the truth of the last year had been processed enough to be present in the room without dominating it, and she sat next to my father and held his hand during the part where I spoke about who my mother had been, which was not the part about Victor Solano, or the fraud, or the investigation. The part about who she actually was. The rose bushes. The Sunday calls. The way she said goodnight. My father had spent 11 months building a case in a room alone. He'd done it because he'd loved her, and because he was a man who responded to injustice with documentation and persistence, which is a form of love that doesn't get named often enough. He'd left me a letter between the refrigerator and the wall, in the gap where he used to drop his keys. He knew I'd look there eventually. He knew me that well. He knew I'd clean the kitchen when the waiting became unbearable, and he left the letter in the place where I'd find it. And that specific knowledge of me, that precise, accurate, lifelong knowledge of exactly who I was and how I moved through the world, is the thing I return to when I think about what he wrote and why and what it cost him to write it. He said no one would believe what happened to her. Now the court record does.